All right. I think we are ready to start.
That's right. Me too.
So if you need a handout, go ahead and raise your hand. I think there's some gentlemen in the back who are handing things out. When you want up here in front, any others? Oh, there's a few up there. Huh? Oh. Okay, let's go ahead and open a word of prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we do thank you just for the ability to think about deep things, and a lot of the things that we've been covering in this Bible training hour have caused us to think deeply about things and challenged our worldview and preconceptions. And Lord, I just pray that as we continue to wrestle with these things, that you'd guide our hearts and minds and help me to speak clearly and articulate truth and to assert things only that the Bible seems to teach and theorize on other things. And I pray that would be clear this morning and that you'd be honored and glorified. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so I don't watch TV or listen to anything that has ads. I am an ad-averse person. I will gladly pay money to not be fed an ad, okay? So I remember when I used to listen to like talk radio, there'd be all these like advertisements they put on there, and there'd be some guy in the background rambling off a huge disclaimer, like as fast as possible. Does that still happen? Okay, all right, it's been like 10 years, so I mean, I'm pulling from a deep one there. So I'm the guy who pays for YouTube, so I don't have to watch ads, by the way. That's how ad-averse I am. I know. Here's my disclaimer. Some of you have been a little uncomfortable with my use of First Enoch and Jubilee, so here's my disclaimer on any class I will rattle off really quick before each one. Ready? Any use of literature outside the Old and New Testament, such as but not limited to First Enoch and Jubilees, is used primarily to fill in Old Testament narrative or demonstrate where various concepts in the New Testament find their origin. These books are not inspired or infallible. These books are not considered Old or New Testament canon in our Western Protestant church tradition, nor is any use of this books an endorsement of their canonization. Just because a book is not canonized, infallible, or inspired does not mean it lacks value. Significant insight can be gained regarding the history, culture, and practices of the ancient audience. Whew, I need to take a breath. But this information is only helpful as it submits to the authority of the inspired Word of God contained in the 66 books that make up the Old and New Testament. Okay? So, there we go. I might have somebody help me with that next time. All right. So, moving on today. Session 7. Demons Part 2. You could also just call this Giants Part 1, but there's only one part that we're going to have time for, so it's just Giants, okay? That's what we're talking about this morning. We talked about this passage in depth 2 weeks ago, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and really the question we're going to be wrestling with this morning has to do with what's highlighted here. I'll read the text to remind us. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. And then 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And then we have this weird phrase, and also afterward, okay? Which means they're on the earth before the flood, and they're on the earth after the flood. And so what is meant by that? And so the question becomes, how did the Nephilim come back after the flood? Now, Ray wanted me to have a Star Wars meme up there of somehow Palpatine returned, if you're familiar with that. I restrained myself, okay? All right. In fact, didn't we actually have that when we taught it a couple years ago? Yeah, okay. I think we did, so I didn't. So this is a serious class. Oh, wow, that's not good. All right. So to backtrack just a little bit from 2 weeks ago, basically what we talked about is that if demons are not a result of angels falling and being distorted in some capacity, then where did demons come from? And the other answer to that, which has been held by a lot of Christianity outside of the Western tradition and the Second Temple period, so think like the time of the apostles and prior to that, was this idea that demons come from the disembodied souls or spirits of the giants, okay? That's how this fits in. We're not just talking about giants to talk about giants. It does relate to demons, which then relates to angelology. And so there's 5 views that people have come up with to answer the question, how did the Nephilim come back? Which is more plot than Star Wars Episode 9 had. All right. So 5 views. There's the local flood view, the survival view, the second occurrence view, the tainted bloodline view, and the pagan ritual view, okay? So we're going to look at these. So you might be thinking, you have 6 pages of notes, how are we going to cover it all? Don't worry, some of it's just for you to look up on your own if you so desire, okay? We'll move pretty quickly through some of this. So the local flood view says God contained the flood in a localized region and did not cover the whole earth. So alarm bells should be going off your mind, but this isn't a viable view already. And I would agree. It's not a viable view because I don't believe the flood was localized. This allowed the Nephilim to escape judgment and find refuge out of the localized flood area. When the floodwaters subsided, the Nephilim just returned to the region. Yeah. So there's some key arguments against that. The Bible clearly states that all flesh died and that was not on the ark. Okay, that's just clearly said. And so this view, it doesn't hold because of that. Jesus compares his coming judgment to the flood and states that no one survived outside of Noah's family in Luke 17. And then Peter repeats this as well. Peter explicitly states that only 8 people survived the flood. So let's look at this, just so in case you're wondering if they just moved out of the way. And also, here's another thing. They weren't just tall enough to have their head above the water, okay? Realistically speaking, just to cover this now, giants were probably something like 9 to 12 feet at the most, okay? Which you might think, well, that's not a giant. I dare you to stand next to somebody 9 feet and tell me they don't feel like a giant to you, right? That'd be like Josh Gordon standing up and then, having like Paul stand next to him. You guys want to demonstrate for us? Paul, does Josh feel like a giant to you? Yeah. Point settled. But look at Genesis 7:21. All the living things on the earth died. Birds, domestic animals, wild animals, small animals, the scurry along the ground, and all the people. Everything that breathed and lived on dry land died. God wiped out every living thing on the earth, people, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and the birds of the sky. All were destroyed. It's like it just repeats itself, like it's trying to make a point. God's like saying, everything died, nothing survived, right? Unless it was in the ark. The only people who survived were Noah and those with him in the boat, and the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days, okay? And so then 2 Peter even says this, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And so even Peter seems to allude that, hey, nothing survived this at all. And he even seems to tie in the events of Genesis 6:4 with that there was nothing that survived. Okay, second view, survival view. Even though the flood covered the entire earth, the Nephilim were able to survive because of their superhuman abilities. Okay, well, they probably did have abilities compared to us, but no, once again, not viable for the same passages we just looked at, right? For one, it says nothing survived. This would also require the Nephilim to survive for 150 days in the water, and even though the Bible never implies they have the ability to do so. And then, Enochian account basically says that everything died as well. In fact, actually, the Enochian account says that God sent angels to slaughter all the Nephilim before the floodwaters came. So there's no possible way if you take in the Enochian account. There you go, Genesis 7:24, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. If you're curious about the Enochian text, 1 Enoch 10:11 through 12. And to Michael, that'd be the same archangel that we know, said, "Go, Michael, bind Shemhaza and the others with them, who have mated with the daughters of men, so that they were defiled by them in their uncleanness. And when their sons perish, and they see the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, until the day of their judgment and consummation, until the everlasting judgment is consummated. Destroy all the spirits of the half-breeds and the sons of the watchers, because they have wronged men." So the Enochian account clearly destroys and binds anybody who's responsible with the Nephilim. Okay, so the first two views, clearly, I don't think we should hold. This view here, Ray keeps asking me what my view is, so I'm just going to tell you. This is my view, the second occurrence view, okay? Not that the other two views after this don't have some merit, but I think they have some flaws that may push me back to this one. The second occurrence view is that the sons of God returned sometime after the flood and began taking human wives and producing offspring. Note, though, very importantly, those who hold this view would see this as a separate group of sons of God, as the original 200 were imprisoned according to the Enochian account. So don't think it's the same necessarily. If the Enochian account is not accurate, then maybe it is the same ones. I don't know. Right, it's really kind of funny in my notes here from the last time, it actually says, pull up the Palpatine thing here, so. All right, I know. So arguments for the second occurrence view. It explains the mention of giant clans throughout the Old Testament text, like in Deuteronomy 3:11, Numbers 13:33, 1 Samuel 17:4. The men of Sodom seem to think that angels were open to sexual immorality. So that's when they're coming to see Lot, and the men out in the area were trying to get the angelic men to come out to them so that they could do unspeakable things with them. And then this one's a little controversial, but there's a lot of church fathers who hold this view, and so I put it on here as a possibility. I don't think there's enough evidence to know one way or another, but the third one is Paul implies angels may still desire to impregnate women when he says head coverings are for modesty and avoiding sexual immorality. Then says it's also because of the angels. Any ladies going like this all of a sudden? No, sorry. Numbers 13:32, so they brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim." And so Nephilim is the key word from Genesis 6:4, but Nephilim is a term for giant, and then there's all these different people groups that are Nephilim. So like one would be here, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. There's that Corinthians passage, in case you're wondering. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. And then the weird thing that Paul says here, because of the angels, right? And so it's almost like, if you look at this, it's like he's saying, hey, woman was, where'd my thing go? There we go. Woman was for man, and that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Like, he's speaking to the natural order of the created order, that women are not for angelic beings. That's the argument. Mileage may vary. I don't hold to it that closely. Arguments against the second occurrence view, because none of these views will be perfect. There is no such reference to this activity of them returning, other than the evidence that there's more Nephilim, in the Old Testament, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, or any other Jewish text. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't evidence of this happening again outside of Jewish texts and other ancient cultures. 2, the extra biblical material indicates the sons of God knew their actions were wrong, 1 Enoch 6:1-5, but did not understand the consequences. Like, they did not know how severe the consequences would be. Kind of like we sin sometimes and we kind of justify in our mind, oh, it won't be that bad. It's almost like that's what those sons of God or watchers were doing in First Enoch. God's judgment on the sons of God and their offspring sets a standard for the consequences and acts as a deterrent for sons of God sinning in the way in the future. So the brutal response that God brings of slaughtering all the Nephilim, imprisoning the sons of God that do this, is meant to be as a deterrent to prevent any others from wanting to do that again. If there were other occurrences, they would be as isolated events and not on the wide scale that led to the flood. And I agree. I don't think it was probably on a wide scale if this is indeed correctly how it happened. Michael Heiser in Unseen Realm, and I don't normally recommend him, but he doesn't mean he doesn't have good thoughts here and there, and so this is one of them. He says this about this topic. He says, Genesis 6:4 tells us there were Nephilim on earth before the flood and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humankind. The when in the verse could be translated whenever, thereby suggesting a repetition of these pre-flood events after the flood. In other words, since Genesis 6:4 points forward to the later giant clans, the phrasing could suggest that other sons of God fathered more Nephilim after the flood. As a result, there would be no survival or the original Nephilim, and so the post-flood dilemma would be resolved. A later appearance of Nephilim occurred by the same means as before by the flood. And so there is one view of looking at it from a textual standpoint, even though his view of where to wherever is a debated topic out there. So just so you know. Okay, tainted bloodline view. This is where it gets interesting. The tainted bloodline view, the other ones were interesting too, but when you've been around this long enough, you've been reading about it, you sometimes find these views and some are like, oh wow, let's explore that some more. This is one of them for me. The tainted bloodline view is, by the time of the flood, human bloodlines were so corrupted by Nephilim blood that there were few pure humans left. So basically they're saying there's been so much intermingling that there's very few purebred humans left. I know it's a weird thing. We usually talk about dogs and stuff like that as purebreds, but we're kind of using that same thing for humans here. God selected Noah and his biological family because of their genetic and moral purity. And we'll look at a text here that seems to maybe indicate that. The wives of Noah's sons, specifically Ham's wife, and Ham's line is where all the giant clans come from in the Old Testament. After Genesis 6:4. Ham poses some real problems for us. But Nephilim ancestors and introduced impurity into the bloodline during the repopulation. So here's kind of how to understand this. Some of those who hold this view would come to Genesis 6:9, and they would read this, where God mentions this about Noah. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, so that's speaking to his moral nature. And then blameless is in his generation. So he's blameless in his generation of people around him. He's set apart, this blameless. Blameless is the same term used for animals later on, where God is telling individuals to take a blameless calf or a blameless goat, lamb, that's the word I'm searching for, as the one not to be spotted, one to be without defect, okay? And so it's a word typically used for when you're sorting out animals. And so Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons. Even though this is the view, I think maybe reading a little too much into blameless here, but you can be the judge of that. Somebody who holds this view, they wrote this: God finds a man named Noah who was godly, and even more important for that time, was genetically pure in his generations. This would include his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, who accompanied him on the ark and became the fathers of all peoples of the earth. But this genealogical purity would not necessarily include the wives of these men. They would likely have carried some of the genetic hybridization that is seen later in the biblical text. And so it's interesting, I don't know if any of you have ever read Jubilees, but when you read the Jubilean text, it attempts to fill in a lot of gaps in the Genesis 1 through 11 narrative. And one of those is it talks about the selection of Noah's sons' wives and how they're a week away from getting on the ark, And Noah suddenly realizes, hey, if we're going to repopulate the earth, we might want a few extra women around, specifically a wife for each of his sons. And so they rushedly pick 3 women and get them married before they get on the ark. The idea of those who hold this view is that Ham's wife might not have been genetically pure, which brings in the genetic code of the Nephilim, which is why you see all the giant clans in Ham's line, specifically following Ham's son Canaan. Okay, that's the theory. I do not hold this view, by the way. I'm just sharing it with you because it's out there and it's a very popular one. Arguments for this view is all the people groups that are associated with the Nephilim are descended from Ham's son Canaan. That's just true. I mean, we have all the genealogies, the references are there in the passages that ties it all back to Canaan, which is Ham's son. The Enochian and Jubilee accounts of God's judgment of the Watchers and their offspring set a severe precedent that would deter future occurrences, and that does seem to be a case if those are accurate. The tainted bloodline view allows for God's definitive judgment while also explaining Nephilim after the flood. So in other words, it prevents the event from happening again, but shows how it may have creeped in. The view may help us better understand why Noah cursed Ham's son. You remember that story in Genesis? Because when Ham sins against Noah, Canaan specifically gets called out and cursed as well. We'll look at that text here in a moment in Genesis 9:18 through 28. If Canaan already showed signs of being part Nephilim or having that genetic code, it may explain why Noah singled him out as he cursed Ham. So look at this in Genesis 9:22. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered their nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his youngest son had done to him, he said, and this is where it comes in here, "Cursed be Canaan." That's how he starts out. "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the Elohim of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And so Canaan is singled out and all his descendants. So, now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment because this is why I don't agree with this. First of all, I think it's reading into the text a little bit, and I think if you really want to play into this, I think less likely is Ham's wife being genetically impure and coming from the flood, because the problem with that is that would imply God goes through the whole ordeal of the flood just to allow one to slip through. That doesn't make any sense to me, okay? That's why I don't hold to this view. But what is possible, that if the second occurrence view is true, and it does happen again, maybe because Ham's wife had seen what had happened, she practiced something that should not have happened, which made Canaan maybe not totally Ham's son. You see where I'm going with that? And that's where it introduces the genetic impurities. So right there. That's my thoughts. Arguments against the tainted bloodline view, which I think is just what I just said. If God's purpose in the flood was to destroy unclean humanity, why would he allow Ham's wife, who is presumed to be part Nephilim, onto the ark? And although the giant clans can be traced back to Ham's son, this does not require that Canaan's mother was part Nephilim. Canaan and or his descendants could have been involved with other spirit beings that produced their giganticism. Okay? So I don't think it necessarily needs to be carried over from pre-flood to over. I think it could just be another occurrence that gets introduced. Okay, last view. Pagan ritual view. Okay, this is where we get a little PG-13. I apologize. A pagan ritual, a priest or other male participant would be inhabited by a Nephilim spirit that we call a demon today in the New Testament, who would physically impregnate a woman. In nations where the king was thought to be a god, he would take women to produce heirs. The resulting child would have a divine status because their father was either fully or partially a god. So in other words, what's happening is you have a human king who allows himself to be possessed by an evil spirit, and when he performs the ritual to produce an heir, he then is demon-possessed and then goes into his queen or wife or whoever the woman would be to produce that heir. And the idea is that union then produces what's called a Nephilim. Okay? It's kind of weird, I know. But this is where, if you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, that is the view from the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's why Gilgamesh boasted that he was 2/3 divine and only 1/3 human, that he was as strong as an ox, undefeated in battle. And so how do you get 2/3 and 1/3? How does that math? Well, the idea, I know, the idea is that if you have a evil spirit, that's the father, and the human king is supposed to be considered maybe a god in that culture, that's where you get the 2/3 divine, and then the 1/3 would be the human mother bringing her DNA to the whole thing. That's the idea. It's weird, I know, but it's a popular view. It's actually the primary view of the Eastern Orthodox Church, it seems to be. Deuteronomy 3:11 describes a 14-foot-long bed owned by King Og, one of the last Rephaim. And if you remember from 2 weeks ago, Rephaim is a type of Nephilim. The description matches the bed found in the excavation of the ziggurat of the Edamananki in Babel or Babylon, and some believe that Edamananki was or is the Tower of Babel. Okay? And so the idea is that this 14-foot-long bed, why the Bible talks about it in such detail when we get to that passage, is that because it's trying to emphasize the idea that this was for that pagan ritual that I just spoke about. 2, it allows for the return of the Nephilim without the sons of God continuing to disobey God, or God allowing Noah's sons to marry someone who was part Nephilim. So it does kind of maybe potentially solve those two issues. Deuteronomy 3:11, for only Og, the king of Bashan, was left at the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. It is not in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. And so people put this as 12 or 14 feet, depending on how you want to dice up a cubit. Arguments against, okay? The sons of God who impregnated women in Genesis 6:1-4 were full spirit beings, not just spirits possessing a human body. This view demands that possession completely alters a person's genetics, which isn't implied anywhere in the Bible. So in order, you have to think about it. When a baby's made, right, there's DNA from the man and DNA from the woman, okay, and that's what there's no indication that a spirit being inhabiting a person passes on DNA. And so you don't really have a good reason to say, genetically speaking, that it would produce somebody who's 9 to 13 feet tall as a result of that. Unless, and already this gets really weird theories that we don't have time for in this whole 12-week course, is there does seem to be some indications out there that demon possession can genetically alter the DNA of animals and people to a certain degree. But that's a whole class on itself that we don't have time for. But that would be the one way how people would rectify that in their mind. Number 2, even if such a pagan ritual produces a unique Nephilim offspring, this does not explain the biblical account where an entire people group are referred to as giants. Numbers 13:32-33 states all the people were of great height. And so you would have to have this happen in to a degree of happening not just with kings, but across multiple people in order to get entire people groups that are referred to as Nephilim. And we already read Numbers 13:32-33. So that's just where the spies are saying that, hey, the entire people, the sons of Anak, we're like grasshoppers to them. So remember when I said this might be the Eastern Orthodox view? It's really hard to pin down what Eastern Orthodox believes sometimes because everything's a mystery to them, it feels like. But for those who get that. But those of you who don't are like, what is he talking about? Father Stephen DeYoung, he's kind of like the Michael Heiser of the Eastern Orthodox Church, except he's a little more conservative in my mind. This is what he was saying on a podcast that I got a transcript from. He was saying, but here's where this becomes important. When the ziggurat of Edamananki was excavated in Babylon, they found a bed with exactly these dimensions, a metal bed with exactly these dimensions in the temple. This bed was a ritual bed that was used for pagan ritual. there was a time of the year, there was a festival where the king would go into the temple. He would be indwelt by the Spirit of God of the temple, the Spirit of the God of that temple, and he would fornicate with one of the temple prostitutes in a ritual act, a pagan ritual act that would ensure fertility and prosperity for the city in the future. But the future king was often conceived in this manner. The idea behind pointing out that this is Og's bed is telling us something about his origin and the origin of giants in general. A future king conceived in this way would have two fathers, the king and the god who the king was embodying, and one mother who was the woman in the temple. So the king was considered to be a god, the god they were worshiping was considered to be a god, and the woman was a human, so they end up with 2/3 and 1/3. I share this so you don't know I'm not just making this stuff up. There's other people who have interacted with this and thought these thoughts. Okay. So which view do you hold? Okay. I said I hold to the second occurrence view, but here's kind of where I want you to kind of settle your mind, because you're probably not going to answer it. People have been cranking on this for decades and not come to a definitive answer. Which view perfectly explains the Nephilim after the flood? We cannot say with certainty how the Nephilim returned after the flood. However, because Genesis 6:4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, we do know that they returned. We also know that the giant clans in the land of Canaan originated from the line of Canaan. This explains why God had Israel take possession of the promised land and wipe out its giant-like inhabitants. God not only gave Israel their own land, but sent them to eliminate the offspring of the Nephilim spirits in the same way he destroyed the Nephilim in the flood. Okay? So I'm going to unpack that now, of why I say that. So tracing Nephilim through history. You should have in your notes the genealogy. Oh, that's really small. Can we potentially, there we go. It's a little bit bigger maybe. Nope, actually didn't change anything. Hold on. There we go. So I'm going to zoom in here for us. So, right, Noah's on the ark. We start with him. He has 3 sons. We're only focusing on Ham's line. Who names their son Ham, by the way? Come on. Some kids are hams, but anyways, we'll move on. And remember, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall be to his brothers. Okay, and so we have here Canaan right here. And when you trace the different people groups, they all seem to be of the line of Canaan that are tied with Nephilim. And so we have Canaan, we have the Jebusites, the Girgashites, Perizzites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Heth, the Hittites. There's even some other names in there. And so how do I know that? Well, when we come to Deuteronomy 20:16 through 18, it says, "But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God." Okay, and so we'll look at some other passages here in a little bit. They'll tie that into Nephilim. There is one exception. We don't have time to cover Nimrod. Some people say Nimrod was a Nephilim because of what it says about him in Genesis 10:6-9, but that would be an exception through a different line of Cush instead of Canaan. Some people even identify Nimrod as being Gilgamesh. I don't know if there really is a reason to connect that, but sometimes people are just trying to connect things and figure things out. It's a theory anyways. But anyways, we're going to focus on the line of Canaan. That's our emphasis here. As we continue down here, I want to show you this on the map. So this is Israel, or the land of Canaan, when the Israelites, under the command of Moses, and then Joshua, I mean, they're really under the command of God, but you know what I mean, are going in on their military campaign to push out the people who already lived there and to then live there. in their place. In fact, actually, they're to do it in a way that they'll be able to kind of, in some of these cities, they'll be able to pick up and live in their houses and take their possessions and their gold and all their valuables. But there are certain groups that God identifies, and we just read that passage out of Deuteronomy, where they're to wipe out every man, woman, child, and animal. Anything that's alive is to be put to death and destroyed. And that's these groups here. And so as the Israelites, maybe I should do it this way. There we go. As the Israelites would come up here and wandering in the wilderness, they would have came around this way and worked with the Moabites, the Emim, the Zuzim, the Rephaim. That's where Og's from. Og was the last of the Rephaim. They wiped them out. They would have crossed the river, come in, wiped out the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Anakim, the Perizzites, the Hittites, and the Amorites, all these being linked to Nephilim or Rephaim type giant clans right through here. And so the problem is they didn't do it perfectly, right? Israel has a little disobedience problem like a lot of us do, right? And so they failed at completely doing that. And that's why later on you'll see David fighting Goliath, who's and his brothers who are part Nephilim. Okay. So that's how that works. So now let's come back to this. So the idea is you might say, sometimes you'll hear people say, hey, God is a moral monster. Why would he wipe out every man, woman, and child and the poor little puppy dogs, right, in the promised lands? And then we usually come up with some kind of moral, ethical answer for that. But my suggestion is the answer is just as simple as they were giant clans, and their time of destruction was at hand, and God used the Israelites to wipe them out, plain and simple. I mean, that might sound heartless, but they are an abomination that God wanted to wipe out. They're not human, fully human, but they are an abomination as a result of sin, and they continued to sin against God, and so God was wiping them out. That's the idea. So why did God require certain people groups to be destroyed, including every man, woman, and child, when conquering Canaan? Well, these groups requiring destruction were giant clans, as I said. And remember, if you remember a little phrase back in Genesis 15:16, Abraham is told this, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation. Basically, Abraham is being told by God what's going to happen when they go into Egypt eventually. He's kind of laying out that plan. And right now, these Amorites you're dealing with, it's not yet time for them to be destroyed. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. But that's one of the people groups that they are to wipe out when they came back 400 and some years later. Abraham fought against Rephaim, which are a type of Nephilim. Okay, so let's look at that here. In the 14th year, that's a mouthful. Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shavah Karatham, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir. As far as El Paran in the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were there dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. And so the Rephaim name is attached to Og, which is part of one of the giant clans. And so you can say, hey, Abraham actually fought against giant clans when he went to go save his nephew Lot back in Genesis. Okay. Whoops, hitting the wrong things. Try that again. All right, the 12 spies sent in the Canaan sea giants. We've already talked about that. The Lord spoke, but I will read it again. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. From each tribe, their fathers, you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in that land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there, the Amalekites who dwell in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. And so you're tying all these people groups together. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw on it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And so you have to think through this a little bit. The word Nephilim is specifically probably used here so that as the Israelites would hear from Moses the account of Genesis, right, Genesis 6:1-4, that they would have an understanding, why are these people so big and where did they come from? What's the origin of why you're fighting these huge people all of a sudden? And it's to tie things together for them to give context, just like most of Genesis is, to give the Israelites context of the world that they are finding themselves in. Descendants of Lot and Esau cleared out giant clans. That's true. So it wasn't just the children of Israel. Deuteronomy 2, so we went on away from our brothers, the people of Esau who live in Seir, away from the Arba road, from Eleph and Ezion-Geber, and we turned and went in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. The Emim, there's our word that ties us to giant clans, formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. There's another word that ties us in there. Like the Anakim, they're also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. The Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave to them. So God is using Abraham and his descendants to wipe out these giant clans in the entire surrounding area of Canaan. All right, time-wise, we're gonna pick up the speed here a little bit. Israel finished off the Rephaim when defeating Og. We've already looked at that passage. You can look that up later on if you want. God gave Israel a general command to destroy whole people groups before entering the promised land. We've actually looked at that text already this morning as well. David kills Goliath, right? We're very familiar with that story. But oftentimes what we're not familiar with is Goliath had some brothers. In 2 Samuel 21:20-22, and there was again war in Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. These 4 were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. And so you still see Israel working through this, and it seems like it's the last remnants of these giants because you don't see them pop up again in the Old Testament. And by the time you get to Second Temple period, they're speaking of all these people groups in the past tense. These giants are no more. In fact, Josephus wrote this about it, and Josephus was a contemporary around 1st century AD, wrote Roman history. He says this, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men. And so Josephus is saying, hey, you can still find some remnants of their bodies or bones being preserved in some capacity, even in his day. So this would be 1st century AD approximately. All right. Anyone have any idea there was so much giants in the Bible? Maybe not. It's not something you talk about all the time. Okay, we're going to move through this pretty quickly. So if giants are all dead and their spirits are still roaming as demons, you should be able to see evidence of that in our world today, and that's true. There is ubiquitous demonic activity across all civilizations today. A survey of civilizations will reveal common themes of demonic activity which mirror the Bible, although when the Bible talks about demon possession in the New Testament, it's always in a negative light. A lot of cultures have a positive light about demon possession, and we'll get to why that is in a moment. This is, if you read this book, language warning, he's not a believer, there's some language in it, but he's a secular psychologist who worked with a group of people who did demon exorcism through the Roman Catholic Church. Very fascinating book. Seems to be very factual. It's not meant to be sensational necessarily. Considering that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, yeah, he's a psychiatrist, I told you. Belief in possessions in primitive, prehistoric cultures was nearly ubiquitous. Certainly the belief in all evil spirits was. In other words, he's saying every culture you survey has some kind of mythology or understanding about demons, what they can do, how you get a demon, how you will exorcise a demon, and all that type of stuff. The few that don't, just because we don't have written evidence doesn't mean it's not there, right? Not every culture has a whole written down history that we can analyze. And as, I don't even know how to say that French guy's name, but work shows such beliefs appear in probably nearly every era and nearly every culture in recorded history too. To underline this point, there has, it seems, never been a time in human history or prehistory either, and that's just going back to written history, so think like Bible, the times of the Old Testament, when beliefs in evil spirits or specific efforts to combat or exorcise them were not present within specific cultures or subcultures. However, these evil spirits or acts of exorcisms were understood, okay? And there's been lots of work done on studies of people who are believers, who are Jewish, who are atheists, that have done all sorts of studies and pulled this all together. Here's a small sampling of the names for demons across cultures, okay? Every culture usually has their own. The one that we're probably most familiar with is, anybody really enjoy the movie Aladdin? That's a demon, by the way. Genie's a demon. He's a jinn. That's the whole idea. Jinn is the Muslim name for a demon, essentially, that will grant you wishes or abilities or knowledge you don't have, is the idea. And so now no one's going to watch Aladdin again. My work here is done to take down Disney. I'll show them for ruining Star Wars. Okay. I'm going to take 4 more minutes to go to 11:35, and we'll tie this together. We already said this. While we are used to thinking of demons in a negative connotation, some civilizations embrace demons and sought them for what they can provide, and that's true. We'll take a closer look at that next week. The nation of Israel was forbidden to seek out demonic evil spirits, assistance, and instead trust in Yahweh, their Elohim, alone. Okay, that's the idea. In the Bible, it's always a negative light, and for us as believers, it really should always be a negative light. We have no business to be messing with any kind of evil spirits or demons. That's not for us. It is forbidden for Old Testament Jews. It's forbidden for us today. It's an abomination. Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 14. When you come into the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to Yahweh. And because of these abominations, Yahweh your Elohim is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before Yahweh your Elohim for these nations which you are about to dispossess. Listen to fortune tellers and to diviners, but as for you, Yahweh your Elohim has not allowed you to do this. Okay? It is not for people who follow the God of the Bible. We are not to be messing with this. Now, we don't have time to go through all this, but it's there in the notes, and that's why I put so many detailed notes in there for you, so if you have interest, you can look at that. Many of you have probably read Deuteronomy passage and just thought, oh, none of that's real, and you just moved on. Like, oh, those silly people in those other nations who are doing all those things. I think the Bible takes it very seriously because they're very real things that you can very realistically get involved in, and even today, but we should not. We must not get involved in those things. Child sacrifice, divination, this all has to do with working and interacting with demons to accomplish a purpose. Okay, so I'm going to share this, and then you just have to say, so why would somebody want to spend time with a demon? Okay, I know that sounds weird. We don't think about it that way. But if there was something you really wanted, and that demon could get it for you, would you make a deal? Would you allow them to embody you? Okay? You might say, what could they offer? Think about this. They are a spirit. They can go to a different place and be undetected and hear conversations and read things and see things that you and I could never have access to. So let's say you're in politics and you really, really want to know what your opposition is thinking or doing so that you can build a campaign to defeat them. You can pull the skeletons out of their closet, so to speak. Be one step ahead of them. You make a deal with them, they get to enjoy your body, you get the knowledge and the power and the wealth and the fame of being able to get things. That's the attraction of demon possession. Idolatry and all these things on this list here are not made up things. They are real, and they're an abomination to the Lord that we have nothing to do with. Okay? And that's why the Bible lays it out such clear warnings for us. We do not mess with that. It is not for us. God has a better purpose for us that's not of this world, okay? We have a future hope to look forward to. There's nothing in this world that is worth trading our bodies for that we can obtain by having demon possessed. And if you're a Christian, I just want to say this, you cannot be demon possessed, and we'll talk about why that is next week. But let's close in a word of prayer. I've already gone over enough on time. Heavenly Father, we appreciate that is what is written in your word. We sometimes take it for granted and just dismiss things that are clearly there for us as a warning and things to learn from the past. And these things are real. And Lord, I pray that any of us who are even dabbling in anything that is called an abomination here in Deuteronomy, that we would repent of that and flee from that. And that you would keep us from it so that we might serve you, you alone. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. On up.